Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Demystifying China's New Retail. My name is Reilly Stevens, and I am going to be your moderator for today's chat. I'm the Director of Insights here at Retail Profit, and I'm so excited for today's chat. But before I get into introductions, I wanted to take everyone through a few housekeeping items. So we've allocated 1 hour for today's chat. We're going to be strictly adhering to this, so we won't be running over at all. We'll make sure we keep things nice and tight so that everyone can get all of the information without having to be running off to different engagements or meetings. You'll notice that for today's chat, the chat box has been disabled. So we're going to be taking all of your live questions through the Q&A box. And that is just found at the bottom of your screen there. So if you have a question, feel free to type it into that box. You can begin asking your questions right now if you already have some, or if you'd like to wait throughout the course of the hour, we will be taking live questions as a part of this conversation. If you're joining us from YouTube, we'll only be accepting questions from Zoom. However, you can use the hashtag as a follow-up to this conversation, hashtag RetailProfitAMA. And we're going to be going through Twitter as a follow-up to this and hopefully answering all of your questions that we weren't able to get to for today's chat. We encourage you to, of course, post, share your thoughts, your feelings, your comments on what's discussed today. And we look forward to seeing all of that on social media as a follow-up. Now for introductions. Doug Stevens is the founder and CEO of Retail Profit. He's currently writing his third and highly anticipated book, Resurrecting Retail, The Future of Business in a Post-Pandemic World. This book is coming early spring of 2021. And the insights that Doug will be sharing today are highly based on the research that he's been conducting to date for the book. Our very special guest today is Michael Zakkour. Michael is a leading innovator and creator in digital commerce and e-commerce. He is a highly expert in the new retail model and consumer-focused technology. He has more than 20 years of experience in e-commerce and 17 years of experience in China and Asia Pacific. He advises brands and retailers and technology companies from around the world on their market, consumer, and digital commerce strategies for the new five of the digital industrial revolution. He has an intimate knowledge and experience in Asia, inspired by his latest book, The New Retail, Born in China, Going Global, How China's Tech Giants Are Changing Global Commerce. I just finished this, I highly recommend it. An incredible comprehensive look, and he'll be sharing his insights from the book with us today. So we're so excited to have Michael joining us today. And we can't wait to continue the conversation around this. Now, many of you perhaps have heard the term new retail coined by Jack Ma in 2016. But for our audience members who perhaps don't understand what this is or have no idea what we're talking about today, I wanted to take an opportunity to level set and to get everyone on the same page. So I thought no better person to ask than Michael. Michael, can you define new retail for us, or unified commerce, to our audience today? We'll get Michael to unmute quickly before he continues.
Okay, we'll try that again. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Reilly. Yeah, pretty simply put, the new retail is the complete, and I emphasize the word complete, integration of online, offline technology and logistics for an entirely new retail and consumer value chain. And when we say complete, we're talking about the Alibaba, Amazon model. And essentially, if you think of new retail being a term that should be interchangeable with consumer centricity. At the end of the day, the entire goal of new retail is to be consumer centric in everything you do. So if you imagine there's a sun at the center of the solar system, and there are 4 power sources in the new retail model that power that. So it's everything IT, data science, and technology driven, everything logistics and supply chain driven, everything consumer and commercial driven, and everything entertainment and media driven. And those 4 power sources have fundamentally changed and are fundamentally changing on an accelerated basis now the way brands, retailers, technology companies, and service providers are serving the consumer. So that is the new retail. And one important note there is really that summer of 2016 when Jack Ma coined the phrase. It was a landmark moment because he committed to building the world's first fully integrated commercial ecosystem, retail ecosystem. But also during that same period, 2 very important things happened. Walmart bought Jet.com, and Amazon bought Whole Foods. And those two events really went hand in hand with what was happening in China, because it was a declaration that the war between the bricks and the clicks is over, and the winner was the new retail. So counterintuitively, physical retail, and you've heard Doug talk about the reasons on why on this, you know, store is the media, store is your best advertisement, store is your experience. Counterintuitively to the digital industrial revolution, the physical still matters. And so what we saw was that move towards the giant digital ecosystem builders moving towards physical, and vice versa. And if you look at where Jack Ma spent the vast majority of his money in the 4 years since his declaration, it's been in physical retail. So investing in the in-time department stores, right? So we look at how's the department store doing in the US? Not very well. How's in-time doing in China? They're doing great, because they put the new retail model to the department store. They invested in 1919 wine shops. And we'll talk a little bit later about Homa or Fresh Hippo, their grocery play, which is really the hub of their entire new retail system. So over and over again, we saw Alibaba Group investing in physical retail. If you look at, you know, some of the other companies over there, Pinduoduo, and their commitment to agriculture and bringing farmers to the fore and integrating into their system, and everything that JD and Tencent's done. So what we're really ending up here is a world of new retail where you can identify, you know, somewhere between 7 and 10 mega ecosystems being built by companies like Amazon, Alibaba, Tencent, JD, Walmart, Target. You're seeing Google and Facebook starting to creep around the edges of how do we get into this game. But it's really going to be a world of those mega ecosystems, and then how can individual brands and retailers fit into them, and how can they build their own mini ecosystems. So that's the essence of what new retail is.
So, hey, Michael, Doug here. So I think one of the things that, and maybe this is just a matter of semantics, maybe it's not, maybe it goes deeper than that. But one of the obvious questions I think that would be on the minds of North Americans or Europeans would be, okay, in concept, I sort of get this, I sort of understand this notion of what you're talking about, but how is that radically different from omni-channel, or what we've been calling omni-channel?
Sure. So we've progressed beyond omni-channel. You know, I've not been shy about saying out loud, I think omni-channel is a zombie concept. I think it was DOA. I think part of the problem with omni-channel is you asked 100, you know, marketing operations, digital commerce people in a room, what's omni-channel, you get 100 different answers. You know, no one was ever really defined. And I think it was a good attempt to say, it was more of a recognition that we have different channels and that we need to serve those channels, and we need to somehow connect them, whether it's through promotions and, you know, how do we drive, you know, store traffic and conversions. And it was about better inventory tracking and knowing where your stuff is from factory to reverse logistics, but it never really quite got there. So what we really see now is the evolution that jumped over omni-channels that we call unified commerce or uni-channel. And that is a core of new retail, right? You're basically saying, as a brand, as a retailer, I'm not recognizing that I have separate channels with separate P&Ls and competing interests. The ecosystem builders are saying, we are building a vast array of habitats inside of this single ecosystem that are completely connected through software, promotions, technology, data science, and we don't care where the consumer enters into any of those habitats on their consumer journey, right? So there's 100 on-ramps and 100 off-ramps inside of there. That's the essence of what, you know, again, Alibaba is the best example because they've built the most robust system in the world. But, you know, when you look at Tmall and Tmall Global for corporates and Taobao and Fresh Hippo stores and InTime, all of those are absolutely 100 connected to the cloud system, to their data science system, the fact that they have, you know, 50 listening points that feed real-time data. By the way, they also have Ali Films, Ali Sports. They have Fliggy, which is a travel agency, and boom, and boom, and boom. What you're seeing is it's this completely immersive, completely almost like a bubble-like cocoon that the consumer, 750 million of them, by the way, who are active Alibaba users. And you see the same thing with JD and Tencent and their ecosystems. And by the way, Pinduoduo is now up to 650 million I think, last count users. So we're talking about, you know, China's up and coming retail commerce player has twice the number of people in America, right? So that's really, it's that complete integration that makes it different. And what you're saying is unified commerce means everything you're doing in making, moving, marketing, selling a product or a service, the channels don't exist. So you get rid of the term e-commerce, you get rid of the term channels, and you replace them with ecosystems and habitats.
Thank you. That's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah.
Now, Michael, you've said on many occasions that China was fundamentally more prepared to endure the disruption caused by COVID-19. Now, it would be impossible for us to have a conversation about retail without touching on COVID and the impact of the pandemic. So I just wanted to ask, number one, can you explain this and why you feel why this was the case?
Sure. So China was fundamentally better prepared at the outset to weather the COVID crisis because they had several of these robust ecosystems already built and in place, right? So just as an example, if we look at for the spike in grocery delivery in North America, I don't know about you guys, but I spent most of March and half of April hitting refresh 100 times on Instacart, Fresh Direct, Peapod, Whole Foods. I mean, I literally had 7 windows open on my screen, and you know, it would take me a week to get a delivery spot, place my order, and then they tell me it'll be another 5 to 8 days before they could actually deliver the food. So you fundamentally went from an online grocery business that was accounting for 4 to 6% of total demand that suddenly was seeing usage rates where 70 to 80% demand was there. Well, guess what? China was already ready for that because they used grocery, food, and beverage as the tip of the spear for everything that they were doing in retail and commerce. So when you had people already spending 40% of purchases for online grocery, when you already had a system where you can sit in your office and literally order a Snickers bar and 2 Red Bulls from Homa, Fresh Hippo, and have it in your office in 15 minutes. Or you could order $800 worth of groceries and have it in your apartment in 45 minutes. That system was already in place. So that full integration between the online, the offline, the technology, and most importantly, the logistics, right? I had nightmare visions of what the streets of China would have looked like if a month into the COVID crisis, you didn't have rapid, easily available food, beverage, and essential delivery systems, right? So while these systems were not built with a pandemic in mind, they were fundamentally built with a pandemic in mind. And so people were able to largely, after some, you know, few early logistical snafus, for the most part, you know, again, we're talking about in North America, you know, roughly 12% to 14%, depending on the category, pre-COVID of digital purchases. They were already operating, depending on the category, in the 35 to 45% of digital purchases. So fundamentally, the consumer journey, the mindset, the familiarity, you know, your average 75-year-old in China knows exactly how to work WeChat and Pinduoduo and Alibaba. There's no learning curve. And essentially, you know, it really had its roots in, you know, I talked about this in my first book, China's Super Consumers. It had its roots more in what China didn't have going for it than what it did, right? So there was no legacy banking and payment system to overcome. So people went right to digital payments, right? Digital payment penetration there is 85%. Digital payment penetration in the US is 6%. All right, so they didn't have a robust legacy modern retail infrastructure, so they went right for digital first and then backfilled by building modern physical structure. They didn't have high ownership of PCs, so they went right to the mobile device. So you had this perfect storm of what wasn't there and what was built, you know, kind of on a fresh foundation 10 years ago, which led to where we are today and how ready they were for all this.
So super interesting. And I think maybe both Michael and Doug, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this as a follow-up to that. You know, we talk about digital penetration and mobile penetration and how, you know, much farther along China is than the North American market. Well, if you're a North American or European retailer or brand, you're probably wondering right now, well, okay, you know, clearly we have to brace ourselves for that time, but how long until we get there, if you had to guess, or what can we expect for the future? Clearly, COVID has seemingly pushed us farther along and accelerated, our path to a fully digital world. As people have been forced to shop online for the first time, or shop for different things that they maybe hadn't shopped online for previously. Can you give us a little bit of insight into how soon we can expect this in North America and European markets?
Doug, I'll let you take that one.
Sure. So, and yeah, and I'm interested to hear your opinion on this, Michael. But I think that my view is, to your point, Reilly, is there's no question, of course, COVID-19 has been an accelerant. Michael made the point that an 85-year-old grandmother in China is quite familiar with ordering groceries online and quite comfortable with that. That was not the case. Clearly, there was this demographic divide as it applied to digital in North American, Western European markets. COVID-19 has sealed that gap. I've talked to so many people just over the last few months that have said, their grandparents were calling and asking, how do I do this online? How do I do that online? How do I subscribe to Netflix? All of these things. And so I think it certainly has accelerated us. But I think the bigger change, really, to Michael's other point, is around infrastructure. And we have not only infrastructure in North America and Western Europe, we have rules that govern what North American and European companies are able to do, which categories they are able to move into comfortably. And I'm talking here about categories like payments, like banking, like healthcare, insurance, et cetera, education, right? We're very guarded in our markets about the infiltration of large companies into those markets. And so those sorts of moves raise antitrust concerns. My belief is that COVID-19 is not only an accelerant, it's a once in a century opportunity, a wormhole, if you will, that brands like Amazon and Alibaba and others can use to accelerate their progress in Western markets. Because look, Western governments have enough to contend with right now without worrying about some of these moves that a brand like Amazon might make into some of those categories. And that, I think, really gets at what Michael was talking about creating a full ecosystem that a consumer can essentially live inside of, that provides entertainment, provides payment, provides shopping, travel reservations, restaurant reservations. I mean, the whole world can sort of exist within a bubble provided to you by Amazon that you can live your whole life inside of. So I think that that when we get to the other side of COVID-19, and of course nobody knows when exactly that's going to be, I think we're going to see a very, very different looking Amazon for sure. And I think we'll see a much higher degree of penetration into Western markets on the part of brands like Amazon and Alibaba and others. So it's going to be potentially, within 5 years, I think it's fair to say we could be approaching the kind of traction that a market like China has around these ecosystems and technologies.
That's really interesting. We actually just received a question from Richard, who comments as well, just prior to you answering that, Doug, on the fact that no merchant payment system has been that disruptive in North American markets. You've got PayPal, but it really hasn't been to the same extent as an Alibaba and WeChat and anything like that. So, would we say that it's safe to say then, based on your answer, that this is because of the red tape that's put out from governments? Is that correct? Or is that the whole story? Or do you think there's more to it as well in terms of why we haven't seen something quite as disruptive in North America?
Well, I mean, just before Michael probably has a better view on this than I do, but I mean, the fact is it's very hard sometimes to get traction for a new concept when the old concept isn't broken. When there is an old concept that you can lean on. And the fact of the matter is a lot of payment technologies in the North American and Western European markets haven't had the kind of traction that we have seen in China, because we have banking structure, we have a fully fledged credit card availability and structure around that. So, you're in a sense, you're trying to fix something that from the consumer's standpoint doesn't look broken. So it's certainly harder to get traction. But Michael, what would you say to that?
I think you're absolutely correct. And it goes back to what I said earlier. It wasn't so much about what China had going for it. It was about what they didn't have, was those legacy payment systems, legacy banking systems. I mean, geez, up until, 7, 8 years ago, and still in some places in China, if you were buying a new car, you literally showed up at the dealership with a duffel bag full of cash. I mean, that's how you bought a car. This is not ancient history. And you don't have the same number of investment vehicles and all that was kind of a blank slate, which is why, by the way, Ant Financial, part of Alibaba, they're talking about a spinoff. They could spin off Ant Financial tomorrow and it would be among the top 20 largest financial institutions in the world. So I think that takes us back to what brands and retailers need to get comfortable with is the idea of digital commerce, right? So stop talking about e-commerce and online versus offline. Digital commerce is the digitization of the entire life cycle and operation, right? So planning, making, buying, moving, storing, selling, and marketing. All of those things are becoming digital. And that's what we're really dealing with here, digital commerce. So that's one. And number two, I also want to make it clear that while we do see these 7 or 8, maybe as many as 10 global ecosystems, right? If you look at, Rakuten in Japan and the potential of Mercado Libre in South America and some of the others, what it's important for brands and retailers to understand is there's 2 challenges ahead. How to understand and plan for offensive and defensive moves in light of those ecosystems. What is my positive play? What's my defensive stance in the light of what those ecosystems are doing, right? But also the challenge then is say, how can I build my own scaled down version of that? And that doesn't mean you have to have a huge amount of resources or be an Alibaba or be an Amazon. You don't have to be a Nike. In fact, most of my clients are SMEs, and what we've successfully done with them is had them rethink their whole approach to the global ecosystems and how to build their own. So how can I, as a brand, successfully better integrate my online, offline technology and logistics, both to serve the mega ecosystems, to serve my direct-to-consumer? Sometimes it's, as basic as saying, wow, instead of just thinking about e-commerce, right? Big problem brands have is making money on their .com, because the economics are really kind of terrible and logistics and shipping eats into most of the margin. So rather I'd ask myself, how do I rethink my .com in light of the fact that there's also third-party retail, digital, third-party specialty, there is marketplace, there's my .com. How do I blend now my KPIs and my operations to account for all that and put it in there? So that's number one. The second thing that we didn't mention, and I think it's important to get any further into the conversation, is what does that mean, right? And it means 3 basic levels. Within this model, we have what's called the 5 New, right? And so you've probably figured out by now, my company's called 5 New Digital because we're focused on transforming companies through all 5 of these new. And what's new is old again, but it's new finance, new technology, new consumption, new retail, and new supply chain. And you require a new way of thinking and acting across all of those legacy operations to make yourself successful in an ecosystem, habitat-driven world, right? So that's what the 5 New are. Once you understand that, then your focus is on providing the consumer 4 things, right? We call those the 4 C's: consumer centricity, convenience, customization, and the chance to contribute. What are you doing to make your consumers contribute to who and what you are? And I'm not talking about things like having a best colored M&M contest. I'm talking about like things that we did in China with LVMH, where they could create their own digital avatars and matrix like jump into the world and actually become virtual KOLs. I mean, things like that. So consumer centricity, convenience of the, the legacy pillars of retail, it's obviously risen to the top. So how do you deliver the 4 C's? You deliver them through the 4 U's, which is dedicating yourself to uni-channel, unified commerce, uni-technology, uni-logistics, and uni-marketing. That's the core essence. And that's within the power of every brand, from a startup or a retailer, from startup to mega. That's within your power to do.
Thanks, that's great. Okay, a couple of things. Number one, I see some people raising their hands. If you have questions, just use the Q&A box down below. We're going to be answering all your questions from there. We've got some more great questions coming in. I have a few more questions before we jump into our live questions. We touched on this a little bit, but I have a couple more follow-ups here. You know, there's clear differences between how China and the US, for instance, handled things like lockdown. So quarantine was obviously a very different experience. Wearing masks, things that are culturally embedded in China that perhaps Americans and North Americans, and even in some cases Europeans, simply weren't accustomed to. So Michael, how do you think that these cultural differences have shown up at retail? And do you think that this has had an effect on the success of a concept like new retail and can translate to an inherently more private consumer in the West? You know, we talk about the red tape from a government perspective, but I would argue that from a consumer perspective as well, we're far more reserved in our willingness to sign up for something that might exploit us from a data perspective or privacy perspective. So can you touch on that a little bit and just share how those cultural differences have shown up in retail?
Sure. So, first you have to say, can you take the Chinese new retail model, unified commerce model, and lift it up in wholesale, drop it down in North America or Europe? And the answer to that is no, right? So when we say the new retail, born in China, going global, they certainly set the gold standard for it, but it's not a completely, fully exportable thing. So the Amazon ecosystem, for a lot of the reasons Doug highlighted and for cultural and technological reasons, is going to look a little bit different than the Alibaba system. But if you look at where they're putting their money, there's no doubt, my last trip before the shutdown, I was in Seattle finishing a client project, and I was there 2 days after they opened the mega Amazon Go. And it was my first time in. They'd only been open 2 days. And boy, did it all seem familiar. Everything was QR code based. Well, Fresh Hippo has been doing that for 4 years. And everything about the Amazon Go experience was just basically, a slightly less mature, watered down version of what Fresh Hippo has been doing for 4 years, right? So, but clearly, I wrote an article last year. I said China's biggest export, this is pre-COVID, to the West in 2020 would be QR codes. And I got a lot of, nobody uses QR codes, and we tried that and it doesn't work. And because the QR code is kind of the centerpiece for the China system. It provides rich data, it provides CRM, it provides your store associates, right, with real-time data and customer assistance. So everything's about the QR code. Well, lo and behold, now QR codes are showing up in stores, they're showing up on websites where people are ordering remotely, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think where it's shown up in retail, the difference there and here is China consumers and the companies that serve them are all operating at a graduate school level of digital consumer fluency, and most of North America and Europe is still in high school. And so what you've seen is in the last 5 months, many people in North America and Europe and elsewhere have been forced to graduate high school really quickly, enroll in their undergraduate courses, and see a hot horizon ahead of them where they need to have that graduate degree in a year, not 5 years. And that's the acceleration. So for brands, retailers, and consumers, it's how do we go from high school to a graduate degree in the next 18 months? Your survival depends on it. And in some cases, literally.
I would add a couple things to that. I think there are sort of three fundamental differences. I think, first of all, as it pertains to privacy, and I think that's a good question, Reilly. I think there's a fundamental cultural difference. We North Americans and Western Europeans tend to look at many things as an infiltration of our privacy or our autonomy or our rights, whereas Chinese consumers have evolved out of a world where the state had a level of surveillance over the public, and that is just a matter of fact. And so when we talk about things like facial recognition, for example, it's it's sort of a non-issue in the Chinese market, whereas it would be, an encroachment of some kind in North America. The other thing is that there's also a different esprit de corps. And I'll give you an example. Michael mentioned In Time department stores, a department store chain with about, I think, 53 stores, went into total lockdown, of course, when COVID-19 hit. They, within days, mobilized 5,000 sales associates across the chain with live streaming capability, using the In Time app, and immediately maintained that connection with consumers. No one was protesting. No one was saying, wait a minute, this isn't our job. It was just sort of an accepted thing. Yeah, we will all do this for the benefit of the company. And I think there is that sort of ingrained cultural difference, that there's a different sense of esprit de corps. And then lastly, it's about big numbers too. Give you an example. Alibaba was working through Ant Financial on a new insurance program, and they launched it. And I think it was within weeks, and Michael can check me on this, but within weeks, they had 65 million people using it. And what is that? That's a 20% of the US population within weeks on a particular insurance platform. So they have the luxury of working with very big numbers to prove out these concepts and programs and platforms that oftentimes betas in North America get, you're lucky if you get tens of thousands of people, let alone 65 million.
Right. And so I think also, Reilly, coming back a little bit to what's crossed the water so far. Well, live streaming is so important in China. It's everything, right? The top live streamers, the KOLs in China, can literally get on a live stream and in 45 minutes move $6 million worth of product, or $10 million worth of product in 45 minutes. So I think you're seeing the use of live streaming and an understanding of its importance in this new retail ecosystem is crossed over. I think you're seeing, a lot more virtual reality, augmented reality, in-store tech. So, we write about in the book, I use a Starbucks case study, and, Starbucks basically said, we went to school in China, we learned how to do new retail, and that's what we've brought back to the rest of the world. So, the Starbucks Roasters concept, the VR, the AR, the clubs, the memberships, the points programs, they did all that there first. So you're starting to see, really how it's crossing over here in terms of the idea about logistics. I think companies have finally woken up to the fact that when we talk about uni-logistics, it means if you were a brand and a retailer who 5 years ago had made a living for 100 years shipping containers or pallets or case packs, or on the other end, you're a D2C who's only shipping individuals, you're gonna have a hard time now, because the demands of the ecosystem players and the demands of your consumers, are, especially in COVID, are saying, well, sometimes we want containers, sometimes we want case packs, sometimes we want individuals, sometimes we want curated packages put together for us. And so that's when we come back to this uni-logistics thing, that don't tie yourself down to one commitment just from, why? Logistics now, what did we figure out in China? That logistics is as important a part of the consumer journey today as discovery and Googling and experimenting. That, we have a saying now, and again, this started in Asia, but it's, moved here, which is consumers have only one overriding demand today, period, above all else. And that is spoil me or else. Spoil me or else I will find a brand, a retailer, a logistics provider who will, right? It's that level of spoil. Like, I'm used to getting something in 45 minutes, it better be here in 45 minutes. I'm used to, and I think this is a thing we'll see here more and more, is in China, the live customer service, while they're on Tmall, somebody immediately comes on within 4 seconds of a request, and they're talking to you live in real time. And we see conversion rates get boosted by 30 to 60% for the guys who are doing not just chat bots, but somebody actually live talking to you. So it's these concepts that, you view it from, there is the new retail unified commerce ecosystems that are being built in North America and Europe. And then there are the traits and technologies and use cases that are being transferred from over there to here.
That's really interesting. I've got so many questions coming through right now, so I'm really excited to get to all of them. But I'm going to ask one more follow-up question to that, Michael and Doug, and then I'm going to throw to our first poll. So my follow-up question actually is a live question as well. It comes from Shannon, and Shannon asks, one of the challenges that North American retailers have with large ecosystems and markets is the distance it creates to the customer. So Shannon's commenting here that success in turbulent times is predicated on understanding and removing friction in the customer journey. So do retailers need to sacrifice this, or should we rethink what customers' knowledge needs to be? Does that make sense? And maybe Michael, can you answer that? And Doug, I'd be interested to hear your comments on this as well, because we talk a lot about the customer journey in our work as well and what that means.
I'll give a very short answer and leave the rest to Doug. The short answer is coming back to the idea that we don't want you to just rely on the mega ecosystems and the distances those create. And that's why we emphasize it's within your power to engage in those ecosystems, but to rethink and redeploy your version of that, right? And so success is going to come from a mix of successfully engaging offensively and defensively the mega ecosystems, but in equal measure, how you rethink and redeploy to keep that closeness and to understand the consumer journey as it exists and as it will evolve. So no, we want you to be doing a small scale version of this as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would add that, I think that there's a fundamental difference in the architecture as well that we haven't talked about. We think in terms of Amazon very often, and the reluctance on the part of brands to become part of the Amazon marketplace for fairly obvious reasons. Amazon really treats every brand the same. There's no sense of brand identity. Brands just get a product page just like everybody else. Now, Amazon is working to change that, but as we know it today, there's not much brand equity on Amazon. And from a data standpoint, Amazon has been predatory with the use of data. They have literally used data to knock off their own vendor partners' products. So there has been this sort of predatory nature of Amazon. When you contrast that against something like Alibaba and the Tmall Luxury Pavilion, which is a sort of a by invitation only platform for luxury brands, of which I think there are about 150 now on the platform. They are literally invited to the platform, given all the resources that they need to build out their own brand presence, to build something that feels very, very, in keeping with their brand essence and their values. They're given all the tools they need to build in things like live streaming, live chat, augmented virtual reality, et cetera. And the data is very openly given to them for their purposes, because Alibaba, at this point anyway, really doesn't seem to have any interest in going into the product manufacturing business and going head to head with those guys. So again, we're dealing with two different corporate cultures as well as sort of geographic cultures in how these marketplaces are built out. And I think Amazon, if they want to entreat more brands onto the platform, they're going to have to start really adopting some of that Jack Ma philosophy.
Yeah, just a quick add-on to that, Doug. Alibaba actually has a program called TMIC, the Tmall Innovation Center. And what they're doing with the data is actually now going to the brands and saying, okay, here's all the data. Here's how we can help you build better products, more market-specific products. So they're not only not competing against the brands, they're using their system to help the brands figure out, how to sell a better shirt based on data.
Yeah, exactly. Much more of a partner than an adversary, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, now for our first poll. So I'm going to launch this poll. I would ask that everyone answer. The poll question today, our first poll question today is, do you or your organizations have a new retail or unified retail strategy? Now, as I launch the results, I want everyone to keep in mind that about 58% of our audience typically is North American. We might have a slightly different makeup today given the subject matter. But while I get you guys to respond here, I have one follow-up question. And we sort of touched on this a little bit at the beginning. And it's, it's about this idea that it's easy for us to talk about the moves that a big behemoth like an Amazon or JD.com or Alibaba is making and implementing this new retail strategy with access to the big budgets that they have, the resources, the strategy, all of that. So if you could provide smaller businesses with one takeaway today, in understanding what the first step is in creating a new retail strategy, what would that be, Michael?
To get over, it's really the cognitive hump and the institutional hump that you have to get over to kind of accept that this is the new reality and that it's necessary to very quickly step back and do an as-is assessment of our current business. And then how do you start developing a to-be state? So, you know, at 5 New Digital, I'd say about 60 to 65% of our work is working with European and North American brands and retailers on that very thing. You know, how do you do the as-is assessment of where you are, and how do you map out the to-be, and then you kind of prioritize the steps towards how can I actually, independent of the big ecosystems, fully integrate my online, offline technology and logistics, and then ask yourself, where am I with these ecosystems too, from an offensive? So that's really the first step. It's always institutional. It's always leadership based. You know, well, we've only shipped, you know, we've been around for 150 years. We're a CPG. We've never done anything but ship containers to Walmart and Target. Okay, but, you know, Walmart and Target are building an ecosystem now, and you weren't used to doing business with them when they were doing an ecosystem and when they're offering marketplaces and Walmart Plus. Your whole equation's changed. So if you don't understand the equation, you're not going to solve it. So the first step is understanding what is the equation I'm being faced with, and then what's the solve. And I think that's the most important first step. And then to be open-minded to say, you know what, there are 6 billion people around the world who aren't European or North American, and they buy a lot of stuff. And why they buy it, how do they buy it, what are they using, who's serving them, how they served, and just, you know, be open-minded enough. So the vast majority of our work in this part of the world is getting companies up to speed on that. And then the rest of our work, believe it or not, and we've seen really demand go high, is companies who want to not just, you know, further explore, expand in China, but all of Asia. You know, for a lot of brands and retailers who are looking at their P&L for the next 18 months in Europe and North America, and it's not looking so great, you know, now is the time for them to look for new consumers and frankly, to dive into these markets so they can better understand. Again, and that's not restricted by how big you are. It's just not, because the tools and the technology is there, right? So when we talk about unified technology, right, we didn't really expand on what that means. But what it means is there's a simplified stack of technologies out there that do 90% of the heavy lifting for you. So whether it's a back-end system, whether it's you know, software that fully integrates your store and your mobile app and your website, there are tools out there that, you know, again, getting advice and looking around and saying, you know, what is that toolbox that's available to me? And which should I pick and choose?
Fantastic. Doug, do you have anything to add to that?
So really quickly, I would just add that I think that it's fair to assume, if you're a brand out there and today you believe that your primary advantage is around convenience and of selling commodity items, I think given what we know and given what we expect to happen over the next 5 to 10 years, I think you're going to have a really, really tough time. If you believe that, you know, you currently stake your existence on convenience, I believe that what I'm calling, and what I call in the upcoming book, apex predators, because that's really what these companies are becoming. They are at the top of the food chain, no natural enemies at all. And they are going to seep into every corner of consumers' lives, and they are going to redefine convenience. So with that said, the commodity market, gone. Convenience, gone. You know, all but I mean things like perhaps gas station convenience, you know, but the rest of it is going to be redefined. And I think that what that means is the new imperative becomes you have to find a new strategic position. in that market with these behemoths that are occupying the robust center of the market and the robust center of a consumer's life, you're going to have to find a new positioning. So in the book, I talk about these 10 new retail archetypes, basically operational archetypes that give you safe positioning relative to these giants. And I think that total rethink of strategy, in concert, of course, with what Michael is calling table stakes, and I agree. This sense of removing all the friction for the consumer becomes table stakes. But those two things in concert, I think, are going to be paramount.
Great. All right, we're going to throw back to the results of the poll. And here, I'm actually personally surprised to see how many people say definitely or somewhat. That's fantastic to see. And of course, a portion of the audience not applicable, but that gives you an idea of really how divided really people are right now on and where they're at in the process of identifying their new retail strategy or unified retail strategy. So now I'm going to be taking some additional live questions here. We have a question from James, which I think is a really interesting question. And James asks, or James states that many of these Chinese e-commerce players are structurally loss-making. They're growing through land grab. As an example, the delivery companies offer products at the same price as they are available in store, but then lose money due to the cost of delivery or logistics. This is particularly true of B2B and B2C in tier 4 to 6 cities in rural China. Hence, it is believed that Chinese retail is experiencing a massive bubble that's likely to burst. And there has already been some correction here. So how is this likely to play out? And how can the industry shift towards a more profitable model? Is this an issue of profitability? And is this one of the reasons why North American and European markets have maybe not embraced these models as quickly? So Michael, can you maybe help to shed some context here? And then Doug, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I think, I think there's some truth in what James is saying, that, profitability across some of these platforms is not there. But I would say the same thing is true of Amazon, right? They're the only company who for 20 years worth of quarters was rewarded with increased valuations every time they lost $5 billion on logistics, right? And so where does Amazon make their money today? They make it in the cloud and they make it in logistics. They don't make money selling you stuff. They don't make money on Prime membership. So if you took AWS and logistics out of the equation, Amazon's a huge money-losing corporation. Well, same thing. Now, that's not true. Alibaba makes a ton of money. They're a highly profitable company. And their profitability comes from the fact that, their unified commercial approach means they're not placing value on one sector more than another. That when you blend them all together, at the end of the day, Alibaba's looking up and saying, did we make a profit as a corporate entity? Yes. Now, for some brands and for some of those smaller marketplaces, James is right. I think even Pinduoduo, isn't a profitable company yet, even though they've risen, kind of out of nowhere in 5 years to be the second or third, depending on your metrics, largest, commercial player in the market. But I think the same thing is happening here. And, we talked about how many brands struggle with their .com, maybe because they don't have the economics right, or they haven't really blended the retail, or they're cannibalizing themselves, so all that's there. So I don't think this is necessarily true of just China. I think there's a reckoning in the entire retail commercial world on what creates profitability, what creates margin, and what blend of logistics and science and data and commercial habitats and media is going to produce that profitability at the end of the day. I think that's a pan-global issue with this new world.
Yeah, so I would add to that, and maybe a more maybe even a more sinister sort of implication here. I think yes, Michael's quite right. Alibaba more profitable than Amazon, partly because they don't really handle product, so to speak, the way Amazon does. They are a pass-through marketplace, a platform that brands exist on and have relationships with consumers. Different sort of operating model entirely. But let's think about it a different way. And this is one of the kind of the cornerstone premises of the book that you mentioned, Reilly, at the top, and that is that this crisis has been like a steroid drip for these brands. I mean, while it sucked the life out of other brands in the marketplace, it has been like a nonstop intravenous drip of metabolic steroids for Amazon, Alibaba, and everyone else. What that means is that their growth is going to be so extraordinary coming out of this crisis that they have to continue to do something to match that growth. And I believe that they're going to look for much, much higher nutrition food sources. And those being some of the categories that I mentioned: healthcare, banking, insurance, those education, those really, really margin rich categories that, oh, by the way, happen to have incumbents in those categories that absolutely suck in a lot of cases. We've seen how universities have been unprepared for a distance education. We've seen, the banking sector, spend decades frustrating consumers and overcharging them on things like fees. So, I mean, these categories are ripe for disruption. This is the window of opportunity that will allow those brands to move into those categories. And at that point, when more and more of their income is coming from these really margin-rich categories, guess what? They can afford to give the shit away on their websites. Give it away, all as a means of attracting customers to that platform. And then, as Michael points out, boom, you envelop that customer with all of these different services and platforms and revenue streams. So I think that ultimately that could be the end game. So I think it's almost a bit of a false distraction to say they don't make money on products. I'm not sure that they ever really see that as being the end goal. I think products become the breadcrumbs that attract customers to your marketplace, so you can sell them all kinds of much, much more lucrative services.
Great. All right, I've got one more poll question. I can't believe how fast the time has gone by. We've got 9 minutes left together here. So I'm going to throw to our second poll and our last poll. And while we do that, I want to sort of pivot the conversation slightly. So we'll go to poll 2 here. And poll 2's question is, as a consumer, do you have concerns over your privacy when you consider the use of facial recognition and other similar kinds of personally invasive technologies? So we'll give you a moment now to answer this. And while we do this, I want to kind of give people, as we start to wrap up today's conversation, I want to give people a few really great examples of companies that are doing this well. We always have companies say, okay, this is all great. I buy into the idea that this is something I should care about. And Michael, I found it particularly interesting towards the end of your book, you mentioned a few really great examples of companies that are doing this well. And in fact, many companies that we reference in our work as well as being winners in the space. So can you just maybe share with us some of the North American or European companies that you think are doing a really great job of this, maybe not to the same scale as an Alibaba or a JD.com or Amazon, but that are creating these different, ecosystems and habitats, as you referenced before.
Right, and so I think we have to just differentiate a little bit, Reilly, between the brands and the retailers, and then the brand retailers. And so from a, kind of a brand perspective, I think Nike. I hate to, go with somebody so good as an example, but they've really impressed me with the way they've, become a digital commerce company, the way they've blended retail and wholesale and online and offline and the integration. And, they're in their own way a media and entertainment company. And, I think they're a good example, when I follow, listening to Doug talk about the store as your media. Boy, they do a great job of that, making the online and offline stores the media and the experience. So I think Nike is a great example of that. I think what's interesting also is I really like what a lot of the D2C originated companies are doing now. I was almost going to say the legacy D2C companies, which is really kind of funny because the category is not that old. But when you start thinking about the Caspers of the world and the Warby Parkers, and they feel like they've been around forever. But the way they have pivoted to building physical environments, the Warby Parker, I love walking into their physical environments and in Manhattan, and just the way they've actually really connected consumer psychology and consumer journey with the physical and the logistics, how they handle the outbound and inbound and reverse. So I think, Warby Parker and Casper to a certain degree, and a lot of the D2Cs have really impressed me with their move in that area. And then also, looking at, Starbucks. But one thing I want to add before I let Doug speak on that subject, we've talked mostly about, mentioned or at least name checked Amazon and Alibaba mostly, but I want, to emphasize again that Walmart and Target are huge players in this. And, 5 years ago when I came out with my initial list, I said, here are the big 7 who are going to dominate everything commercial in the next 10 years. And, I said Amazon, Alibaba, JD, Tencent, Apple, and then I said Target and Walmart. Well, people looked at me really funny, and they still kind of do. Like, which one of these doesn't belong with the others? But let's keep in mind the power that those 2 companies have. And, it's reflected in how they've performed through COVID. I mean, man, they've impressed people. And so just from a retail perspective, I think Target's nailed it. I mean, I think they got the best retail app from a mass market retailer in North America. It's certainly the one I use the most and enjoy the most. So I think, those are a couple to keep an eye on too.
I'm going to defer to Michael on that in the interest of getting as many questions in as we can.
Very kind of you. All right, I'm going to share the results now of our second and final poll. And somewhat unsurprisingly, most people have answered between somewhat and definitely when it comes to their concerns over privacy when considering the use of these technologies. So very, very interesting. Okay, now we talked about some examples then. I guess my last question is, how do you see it, what would be potentially a piece of advice that you would give? I know we talked about what's the first thing people can do leaving this, but what is one thing that you think it's important for people to really understand? If you could say one last thing that you want people to take away from this, what would that be? And how can they feel good about moving forward knowing what they've learned today?
I would say that this is a retail renaissance. We've heard for years about that term, the retail Armageddon. And I think people were confusing legacy stores closing, right, with, people using the terms retail and store interchangeably. And I think they're 2 different things. So I think the thing here is we are at a point where we're kind of having a retail renaissance, and there have never been more tools, technologies, physical spaces, creative thinking around how to connect with a consumer than ever before. So if you take the attitude that this is a time of renaissance, which does include some destruction and reshuffling of the deck, but, really embrace this as a time, as Doug is emphasizing, I think this is a great time if you're going to be a startup brand or a new retailer or a new apparel brand. Like this is your moment to go, and if you're a legacy player, it's your moment to reinvent. So I would just say, take the attitude that this is a time of renaissance. Number 2, take the time to educate yourself about what's happening globally in retail and consumer journeys and consumption, and the difference between ecosystems and channels and habitats, get educated on that. And then number 3, just take a step back and say, how can I seriously assess my as-is state, and how can I seriously create a profitable to-be state?
I would echo that. I think that it really is, yeah, I mean, it's sort of like, when you go to renovate a house, there's a point at which the cost of renovation becomes less than the cost of building a new house. And it's easy to sort of cross that line without thinking about it. And I think that in a lot of cases, to Michael's earlier point, in a lot of cases, I think we've been dealing with North American, West or European companies, or you could add you could add into that Central South America, Australia, New Zealand. I mean, a lot of companies out there have been trying to refit or renovate their existing structures, their existing systems, these two sort of disparate silos of online and offline, trying to rehabilitate those to a point where they seem current or they seem in keeping with what consumers want. And I think that sometimes you also have to just sort of say, okay, let's continue to operate the way we do, but in the background, let's get a clean sheet of paper, and in the cold hard light of 2020, understanding what we know today, let's just rethink the entire thing right from the beginning. And as Michael said, rather than putting ourselves at the center of the map, let's put the consumer at the center of the map and see what that looks like, you know, for a change. Let's not consider ourselves to be in the business of moving products, but rather in the business of really moving hearts and minds, and really trying to create that ecosystem of value that may go well beyond the product. It may include all kinds of different things. I think this is the perfect historic once in 100 years opportunity to completely rethink everything. And I would encourage anyone listening to go through that exercise.
Fantastic. And on that note, that concludes today's live and interactive AMA. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you so much to Michael for taking the time out of his day to be with us today and shedding so much knowledge for everyone. If you have
thank you, Michael.
questions, please don't hesitate.
Thanks, Reilly.
Join us on social media. You can use the hashtag Retail Profit AMA on Twitter or Instagram or LinkedIn, and we'll be checking all of those platforms to get back to you. And we hope that you'll join us. We've got a fantastic lineup coming in the next couple of months, which I'm so excited to share with you all. And we will we'll chat to you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.